So it is my pleasure this morning to introduce Jess Fiedororwicz. He is an associate professor of psychiatry here at the University of Iowa, and he has actually gotten a career development award from the NIMH, and that's not to say that NINDS isn't good, but a lot of his work focuses on the brain, of course, and he has had some experience in thinking about this from the perspective of both NINDS and NIMH. And I think will bring unique insights, and his project is also really cool. So with that, I'll hand things over to Jess.
Greetings, everybody. I'm excited to be here, and excited to meet some of you guys last night. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of my story with the Career Development Award, what's happened with it, and then I'll sort of pan out and more broadly speak about what are some Career Development Award opportunities through NIH and specifically through NINDS. I also spoke to program both NIMH and NINDS before this to get some pearls for you guys for preparing applications if you're going to be doing so. As my disclosure, I was supported on a K-23 award through NIMH. How many people here have a career development or K or on a K award? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. What I'd like to do is so people get a sense of what people are doing on them, if you don't mind, I'd like to have each of you four sort of introduce yourself and then tell me when your award started, and then maybe just like a sentence or two about both the career development plan and the research project, because those are the two big components.
So I'm Sarah Blanton, and I have an American Heart Association career development
yes.
award, in the process of resubmitting my K award. Any other questions?
No, the career development plan and the
so
research
part of my
project.
training plan was actually taking a class in study design and methodology and stats, so this has been a great...
And here you are.
Yeah.
Okay, great. This is part of that. And the project?
Mm-hmm. It's working with a family-focused educational study for patients, for caregivers of patients with stroke.
Very good, very good. And that's a good reminder, too, that there are career development award options through places other than NIH as well. You're on a career award, is that right? No? Do you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm Sarah Fiedororwicz at the University of New Mexico. I have a KOAT through our CTSA, another source that I believe. Our KOATs are 5-year awards.
Oh, wow.
So I'm partway through.
Cool.
It's halfway through. The training component, I've done quite a bit of training intramurally during my fellowship at NIH, so I'm able to import some of that training, but done additional statistics and study design.
Excellent. And the project?
So I'm looking at repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation as a treatment for cervical dystonia. So we're just completed a pilot intervention looking at sight as what would be most promising.
Very cool. Thank you.
So my name is Brad. I have a K-23 through NICHD, and my research plan is doing a pilot clinical trial of N-CTMC for kids with attention problem after brain injury. And my training plan is really focused on learning more about clinical trial methodology, unique ways to study that population, and learning more about neurocognitive behavioral measures and outcomes in the population.
Very cool. Great. Thank you.
My name is Mayor Patel. I'm a trauma surgeon at Vanderbilt, and I've got a bridge support award internally, sort of kind of like a KO2 equivalent.
Okay.
Through our physician sciences development program, it's a bridge to a K award that I've submitted. So my work focuses on recovery from coma, severe traumatic brain injury and coma, with sympathetic excess associated with it. Sort of have a pilot RCT that engages that, as well as the 3 domains of my career development, which are sort of autonomic dysfunction and the sympathetic excess piece, clinical trials, and methodology, and sort of long-term psychological training, which is a big strength at our institution.
Great, awesome. Thank you guys for sharing those stories. And how many of you have an application sort of either pending or in progress, like submitted or in progress? Okay. several more hands, including some snow hands. Great. Okay. And how many are considering potentially applying for one in the future? Okay, so this seems like a good chunk of the audience is relevant to, which is encouraging. And we have, in fact, 4 people that are on KOAT right now and are subsequently similarly qualified to give this talk. Although I'm a little bit jealous that you guys are early in your KOAT, since mine will be expiring in the very near future. In fact, so near that I'm starting to count it down. And sometimes it feels like at midnight on November 30th, I'm going to turn into a pumpkin. And we all know what happens to pumpkins. So this is a scary time for me, and I hope at some point, perhaps 5 years from now, to be giving a talk on K to R transitions. But as of yet, no one, appropriately, no one has invited me to give that talk. But what I hope to do is share my story a little bit about the process of putting together the application, what I've learned along the way, and what I'm trying to do to avoid that fate of the pumpkin in that Hitler's mouth.
I like the one that's run over.
I like that one run over that car. Yeah, that's great. Anyhow, my kids love hippos eating stuff. And so I've just had these pictures up here to sort of go through the timeline. And so the first picture is when I did my first KOAT application. And then the second picture is when it's funded. And so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my story leading up to the Yeah, it takes a while. They get bigger in the meantime. And so I went to medical school at the Medical College of Wisconsin. I had come there as a psychology major, but had no intentions or plans of going into psychiatry at the time, although it ends up making my career plan look much more linear when I write it on paper than it was in real life. I did 2 summers of research there, one before my first and second year in a vascular physiology lab. It was a good experience. I didn't get any publications from it. And I was doing whole animal work at the time, which is very different than the kind of work I do now. And it's just serendipitous. I do cardiovascular research right now. So I look at cardiovascular risk with depression, anxiety, stress, and as an effect of psychiatric medications. But also that makes it look much more linear than it is, than it was in real life. It was more fluid than that. During medical school, I became very interested in the clinical years and the interface of medicine and psychiatry. So I liked almost every rotation that I was on, so it was very hard for me to decide on a field. And psychiatry was certainly one of my favorites, but one of the things that really motivated me is in my non-psychiatry rotations, I was really struck with how patients with psychiatric disorders were treated on other services. And I felt they were actually treated pretty poorly, and actually had one case that was particularly horrific, and the patient died. And so that made me very interested in the interface. And so I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do clinically even at the end of 4th year of medical school. So I applied for residencies in 3 areas: internal medicine, psychiatry, and then medicine psychiatry, with the idea of working on that interface. So if I went into medicine, I was going to work with patients with psychiatric disorders. I ended up doing psychiatry, and so I did a transitional year first because I wanted to have a better medical background, and then did residency. And in my residency, I ended up doing a chief year, and as doing that, you took on these administrative duties, so there's no time for research. But I did do 2 small projects. One is I helped out on a clinical trial doing structured interviews, and I don't know if anyone's done structured psychiatric interviews, but they're pretty painful. It's a great thing to recruit residents to sort of try to help on, because it's not that competitive. And then I wrote a review article, and that was it. So coming out of residency, I had 1 publication. It was a review article in a lower tier journal. But I was interested in research. I was interested in research on that interface. And so that brought me from Baltimore to Iowa, and I came here for a T32. And that T32 gave me some protected time to develop my work. And I think these programs are now extinguished, but I was in a K30 program at the same time, which was essentially like a precursor to some of these training programs that are now embedded in CTSA grants or the like. And through that, I completed a master's degree in clinical investigation, which was like epidemiology. And my interest was very clearly an intersection between cardiovascular and psychiatry. And so as I'm in the fellowship and thinking about a training plan, it was very easy for me to think about what kind of training I wanted to get. I had done a psychiatry residency. I was interested in cardiovascular outcomes, so that piece was obvious. And I was also, through the process of my coursework, fell in love with applied statistics. And so I knew I had this interest in quantitative methods and wanted to learn more about vascular physiology. So for me, the training piece was really obvious, and the KOAT was a natural fit. Much harder part for me was coming up with a research idea that was fundable and that would be of interest to programs. So that was the bigger challenge for me. So I'll go to, I think, the timeline next. Yeah, so this is sort of the timeline. A couple things I want to emphasize on the graph is it certainly was a long process for me. So if it's feeling like a long process, it can be. And I think you guys have probably talked to plenty of people who've given you the message to be persistent and to not give up and to sort of keep trying. And that's certainly what I did. So I mean, the gap between the RO3 submission and the K23 start date. So the RO3 was the first project idea that essentially evolved. It got really slammed hard in review, but it was an overly ambitious RO3 from a super junior person. I mean, I had mentioned when I came out of residency, which would be 2005, I had the one publication. The first submission of the K23 I had 6. So the RO3, I don't know what it was, but it was had probably a couple. And I submitted an overly ambitious RO3, and so you can imagine what study section did. I suspect they didn't even blink as they sort of threw it into the pyre. But you can see there's a pretty long gap between that and my K23 start date, almost as long as my 5-year K award period. So I certainly encourage people to be persistent. My first, I'm trying to remember the first application. I can't remember. I think it got triaged. It either got triaged or it got a pretty bad score. So it was somewhere in that sort of netherworld. This was in the days of 3 submissions. My second submission, I got a good score, close to fundable, and I was told by people that 5 years ago this would have been funded. I imagine you guys have heard similar messages from grants. In the meantime, I submitted for KL2, and that process is much faster, so that got awarded shortly after the first submission. But as it turns out, you can't submit for an NIH K award in your first year of KL2, or at least it was the case at that time, which I didn't know, and I had applied for it, and so I got in sort of an awkward position. And so again, another lesson from this is there can be some awkward administrative things that can come up, and try to persist and not be too discouraged. I was discouraged. So essentially I had to decide whether to withdraw my K23 submission or to rescind the KL2 and reimburse the funds, which was like 2 months worth, so that wasn't as huge of a deal. And my mentors were very clear with me that they said, do not take back your K23 application. Your last one was very close to being funded. You've addressed these things. And then, unfortunately, I did not. And the third one ended up getting a score of a 10, and so it was clearly funded. And I've been on it since. Let's see. So, some challenges for the application. So I already mentioned this. For me, the project was a very big challenge. Trying to come up with a project, and one of the initial criticisms of my project was, why not? Why aren't you studying this? So the project was looking at cardiovascular side effects of second-generation antipsychotic medications, and one of the big questions was, why aren't you studying this in an animal model? Why are you studying this in people? And so that was a challenge for me. Fortunately, in that time frame of those critiques, there were several studies showing that animal models don't show the same changes with antipsychotics, and so they didn't see the weight gain in animal models with antipsychotics that you see with humans and some of the other effects. So I was able to actually have more than just a clinical relevance argument, but actually an actual physiological argument, so that helped. For me, the career development plan was very easy. I knew what I wanted to study. It was clearly distinct from my prior training, and I was really excited about doing it, and it was more just sort of focusing it than trying to come up with something. As you'll see in my later slides, from talking with program, that oftentimes program feels that the career development plan isn't particularly particularly well developed or justified. And one of the terms that program told me is it looks like a boilerplate. So something to keep in mind is if you not to sort of put that aside, that they take the career development plan pretty seriously. For me, that was the easy part. The project for me was a real struggle and sort of trying to put it together. Responding to review, and so I sort of mentioned the second piece before, but some criticisms are addressable, and those are kind of fun because you can feel like, okay, I've clearly responded to this. Other critiques can be a little harder to address, so that maybe that they just, I sometimes think of it like this, that if they just don't like the overall idea or they don't get the overall idea, they're going to be much less generous, and you can find all kinds of things in a project. And when some critiques are like that, it can be a little harder. Fortunately, while that was the case for my IR3, where I didn't even resubmit it because it just seemed like there was just no enthusiasm for the project, the most substantive of the critiques I had were things that I could really respond to. But that was a challenge. And then the administrative challenge. And I mean, this may seem unique, but it seems like almost every project I do, there's some sort of administrative snafu that comes up that was unexpected. So I had a Young Investigator Award as well around the beginning of this K Award, and I remember I had a climber at University of Michigan who was doing some genetic work, and I was going to be sending them samples. And my IRB was saying, you have to get the Michigan IRB first. And Michigan IRB was, I think, appropriately saying, no, you need the main project IRB where you're recruiting the participants. And it was a 2-year award, and we had a 3-month IRB gridlock. Which was pretty frustrating. And so I think all of you probably have similar war stories about various projects. So these things come up, and I think the lesson is to try to persist through them and try to navigate through them as best you can. This is a challenge also for my recent R01 applications. Trying to budget a project that will be competitive, but with the amount of funds you have. I think it's especially challenging on a K award. Although, as you'll see, K awards can vary considerably on how much support they get for research. But to put together a competitive project that you can really do on the amount of money in the budget, I think is a big challenge for putting together a career development award. I was fortunate at the time of the initial award to have a mentor in a lab that was at the time well supported. As you'll see in my subsequent challenges slide, that changed. And so he was able to discount some of the work and some of the procedures for me, which I think helped put together a more competitive application. So if you have a mentor, and one of the criteria they're looking for in a mentor is someone that's going to be available and provide real mentorship, but also provide some material support as well. And certainly on the front end of my career development award, I had that and was pretty fortunate. All right, so this gets into post-K. The kids are getting quite a bit bigger. As you can see from this slide, my daughter is a force of nature. We sometimes affectionately refer to her as the honey badger. She is pretty outgoing, and you can see her popping out of that frame. That's sort of when I got up this morning, she was up before me and she's very high energy. But they were growing up essentially through the K award. So as I mentioned earlier, my career development plan focused on 2 things. One was cardiovascular physiology, and the second was on quantitative methods and epidemiology, or essentially applied biostatistics. I love the coursework. I really enjoyed this line of coursework. In fact, I've always loved school, with the exception of I went to a pretty traditional medical school. In the first 2 years, I wasn't the happiest person. Routinely memorizing lots of stuff and regurgitating it. But I felt like this coursework wasn't regurgitation. I felt like I was really learning stuff that I could apply, and I really liked it. In fact, so much I ended up finishing a PhD during the Career Development Award, and then after the PhD, I went back and got a graduate certificate in biostatistics, including a class with Chris Coffey, who you guys worked with here. I also found a lot of cool opportunities to work with existing data. So while I was collecting data, I had a lot of opportunities to work with other people's data, use data sets that were going to be, that were the primary purpose of something else, to try to ask the questions I was asking. One of the challenges I had is if it was a cardiovascular data set, oftentimes the psychiatric data was pretty poor. And if it was a psychiatric data set, the vascular stuff was usually pretty horrible. But I was able to stay productive with that and maintain pretty high productivity through the Career Development Award. And now I'm over 60 peer-reviewed papers, and almost all of those are with existing data. I was slowly putting stuff out from my own data collection, but I was fortunate, I think, to have access to a lot of data that really helped get things going. My direction also changed over the course of the grant. So I had what I thought was a fairly interesting project. I was looking at vascular physiology measures. So we put art lines in for our studies and looked at vascular function as it changed on these medications. But what my data was more consistently showing was less in the way of medication effects and more in the way of effects of the course of illness. And so people that were really depressed with mood disorders or were having a lot of anxiety, we were seeing more vascular changes on when people were stable. Well, the study wasn't directly designed to assess that. This was also something that was coming up in my analysis of the data sets. So I went there looking at med effects, but what I found was that course of illness seems to be really relevant. And so, and guess what? Stress impacts your vascular physiology. It's not a huge surprise, but it is, I think, very important and very interesting. And so my work has been kind of moving in that direction. And so my recent submissions, I think I can go back to this. Yeah, so these arrows here are R01 submissions. And so my chair was happy that my first R01 submission was more than 2 years before the end of my K, but unfortunately that one ended in a dead end. The first one was no score, and the second one got an okay score, but not close to funding. And then I just put one in. I feel like it was last week, but it actually went in 2 days ago. So from sponsored programs. Let's see. And so I've been trying to get subsequent funding. It has moved, like I said, in a different direction from the original K23 project. But I think that's actually one of the nice things about Career Development Awards is with the protected time and freedom, you can dive into a number of areas and you can sort of find a path. And my path happened to be different than what I would have written in the original K award, and I think is often true in science. My main project ended up actually being pretty difficult to recruit for, and that was one of the criticisms that I had on the original grant, and I think they probably should have even emphasized it more having done it. So that's another thing I learned. So think about feasibility of recruitment, and I'm sure that's probably been hammered into you guys in the clinical trials course since recruitment is so key. But I was probably naive to say that I was going to find people within 72 hours of starting a specific medication. That was quite a barrier. I ended up working with the program and broadening my criteria to meet the recruitment goals, but my initial application was pretty naive. In fact, I may have my pendulum may need to still find the balance, because one of the criticisms of my R01 applications was that I was studying sort of too broad of a group, and that may not have been random. So award challenges. I like all the work that I'm doing, and that balancing it was often a challenge. So balancing coursework, clinical work, and research. So I think it's helpful to have sort of what are your key priorities and have them in order, because there are going to be conflicts. So I don't have any conflicts of interest, but I have a lot of conflicts of commitment, and I suspect that that's true for probably everyone in this room. But that's definitely was a challenge that continued through the Career Development Award. Managing lab staff was a bigger challenge than I expected. As an attending physician, I tend to not have much difficulty sort of managing a team, and often my teams have very different, varied skill levels, and where it can take me a while to figure out what this person's educational needs are. But the lab side ended up being I think it's harder in clinical work, but I think I'm better at it. I'm not sure why, but managing lab staff ended up proving to be a challenge for me that I worked on. Later in the K, I worked more with human resources with some of these things. My system, and at least for me, that was super helpful. if anything, just to reinforce that, okay, this is a good way to approach this issue. And so I encourage, if you're having difficulties in this area, to consider getting help from either a mentor or in my case, I felt like HR was the most helpful because they had just sort of clear plan. Okay, here's some things I suggest. Why don't you get back to me in a couple weeks and let me know how it goes? And that was helpful. And we had a lot of it, and it was especially challenging because there were some performance issues. There's also lots of personal issues going on as well, and you want to be sensitive to that and balance those things. And I think that's where I think the experience of someone in HR who deals with this on a daily basis, I think, proved really helpful. Staying focused with freedom. So this is a personal vulnerability for sure. I think one of the reasons that I was able to be productive publication-wise is that I was sort of more than willing to loosen my focus because everything that came in front of me I thought was super interesting and exciting and pursue it. And my mentors often tried to help me stay focused because that was certainly not a natural strength of mine. So that was a challenge for me. My research mentor left in October, I guess November of this year. And so this was in my 4th year of the K. So that was a challenge. The piece of the challenge, if it was earlier, it would have been a bigger challenge. My original K award had a plan for what if a mentor leaves, and specifically for this mentor. And so one of my consultants was lined up as part of the plan. So I had a pretty clear plan there, which was helpful. It actually worked out well too. The same thing happened on my dissertation. One of my dissertation committee people left, but I had gotten pulled into a dissertation committee for somebody else that had an aneurysm. And so I had an extra person on there as well, and so that worked out pretty well. So twice it worked out well that way. There were some opportunities that came with this that I think I'll talk about later. Fortunately, this was in my 4th year where I really was transitioning to independence, and my interests were clearly, I think, were clearly differentiating from my mentors at this point. My mentor was in internal medicine too, so I think it was also delineating my work from my mentor's work, I think, was always a little easier because I had a different training background. I was a psychiatrist and he was an internist. But this was even a bigger challenge, was that he had lost funding and lost his lab. And his lab was where I was doing all my data collection. And so he had several staff in his lab. He had like 4 lab staff and they all left. And so there was nothing there. And so I'd actually had this conversation with him before because I knew that while I had a diversified portfolio of stuff that I was publishing, my data collection was really all through his lab. And so I was very dependent on his lab. And I had conversations with him about that. For most of the outcome measures, I was able to sort of patch through other people that could do them, but as you can imagine, that's not the smoothest transition, and there's all sorts of problems there. So this was a bigger challenge for me. This is a challenge that I'm far from overcome. I'm still, there's a junior collaborator in physiology here with a similar interest, and he and I are trying to sort of get things back together, but the two of us combined are not the equivalent of a senior human vascular physiology guy. And so that's been a big challenge to the award. And I think, as you guys know, people move, and there's lots of transitions in academics. So I don't think this is super unusual. So this sort of thing can happen, and so try to be mindful and prepared. So benefits. I think this was, very much the right step for me, and really a great opportunity to start my career. I developed a niche. Quantitative methods may not be a super unique niche, but certainly there aren't a lot of psychiatrists who are interested in vascular disease as I am, and that certainly helped carve out a niche for me. The protected time is great. It gave me freedom to do important research as long as it was low cost, of course, because the primary project was already pretty strained on the budget. And even take some risk with projects that may be a little higher risk, or maybe where there's funding possibility, but it's not an obvious path to funding. And then, of course, support for the primary project. So I hope that I've encouraged you to consider applying and seeking out a career award project, because I think that it can be a really helpful way to start your career. So that being said, I'm going to now transition to talking about sort of what resources are available for career award projects focusing on NIH-funded projects and research. Do you have any questions for me about my path or project or anything like that? All right. There's a lot of online resources. Sometimes I find, though, when I go to these sites, it's almost even overwhelming. So I'm hoping to give a summary of that, so maybe a little easier to navigate. But sometimes opening up a program announcement can be, I think, when you have a busy schedule, it can be kind of daunting where it's hard to get yourself to sit down and actually read it. And so there are some things that can make it a little easier. So there's this central kiosk for information on NIH career awards, and has a lot of links. Some of the links are pretty dense. One of the ones that isn't so dense is the career award wizard. And do we have internet connections here? Do we?
Yeah.
Are we? So why don't I think it might be helpful to actually illustrate this so that way you know that what's available. So is there someone here that wants to volunteer that's thinking about applying for a K award?
Sure.
All right, sure. So do you have a research degree or PhD equivalent or health professional degree, MD?
MD.
What, MD? Okay. And for MD PhDs, most of these will allow sort of both options, so you kind of have the flexibility to go down both routes. So it says, have you successfully competed for independent research funding? The most awkward definition ever, by the way. So in preparation for this talk, I went to see how they define independent research funding. And they define it by the awards that it's not. And so instead of saying if you have any of these awards, you're an independent researcher, they list the ones that aren't independent research awards, which I think is a little more awkward. But R01 or equivalent of a program project grant is the gist of the main grants that are. R03 does not count. R21 does not count. So yes or no?
No.
Okay. And you need 3 to 5 years of support for additional supervised career development. Whoa. Sure, I heard someone say yes, so why don't we just go with that? So it has two options here. This brings it to K23 or KOAT. K23 is for if it's patient-oriented research, and KOAT if it's for health-related research, but that doesn't directly involve patients. So then you sort of have those options. I think this can be maybe a useful tool for starting out. But you don't want to end with that tool by any means, as we'll see. And then I have this site up here for NINDS. If you Google NINDS K Award, you'll get that site immediately. The reason you don't want to just go with that navigator is it's not surprisingly more complicated than you might think. So K Awards vary by institute. So each institute sets up their own parameters for the K Award, and they each may have their own sort of emphases or idiosyncrasies. So I've taken the KO1 as an example in contrast to the NINDS, which is, I think, probably relevant for most of you, NIMH, and we have someone who's funded through NICHD as well. Eligibility for the NINDS KO1 is for people with PhD or equivalent in their first 3 years of faculty. They're pretty specific about the timelines here. You can sometimes get an extension, but you have to contact program for it. And it is by application date. And so if you go 2 swings, it's your second swing has to fall within that. If you did residency or some sort of clinical training, they don't count that time unless you spent more than 50% of your time doing research. If you had something coming up like having a child or a family or some sort of a career change, you can contact them to get special permission for exemptions. But this is something you want to keep in mind because I've been talking to the program, it sounds like there have been some people that were qualified in their first submission, got a good score but not fundable, couldn't resubmit because they no longer met that criteria. So you want to check these things out. And the NINDS KO1 is for folks from underrepresented backgrounds. NIMH, the focus is less than 6 years postdoc experience. When they use postdoc, they're usually referring to PhD or equivalent, but nowhere on the NIMH site does it specify PhD or equivalent, actually. NICHD is clear that it can be in research, which would be PhD or equivalent, or health professional background. I believe NIMH is the same, but they don't specify it anywhere on the site. Some specify what area of study you have to be, so they may say it has to be in this, or it has to be in one of these 3 areas. NIMH is generic, so they don't specify what area of study you have to do for the KO1. NINDS is it might as well be, I guess, with term neuroscience. I imagine you could probably fit a lot in there. NICHD is very specific. They want it in one of three areas: rehabilitation, child abuse and neglect, or population research. So, of course, you could look at population research for a variety of questions. Support also varies for each of these awards. So the NINDS one provides really great research support. So $85K per year for salary plus $100,000 a year for research support. So much more generous research support than NIMH or NICHD. So NIMH is $90K of salary plus $50K per year of research, and NICHD is $25K per year for research, which makes for a pretty tight budget. If you think about the cost of having an RA, that could eat up the entire budget for both the NIMH and the NICHD awards. And then you can see they did vary on the time frame some. So a KO1 from one institute is not the equivalent of a KO1 from another institute. And so this is something to keep in mind. And this slide was actually brought up to me by the program director, suggested I do something like this to contrast how varied it is. Because sometimes if you talk to someone in another field that goes to another institute. And one of the things they suggest is try to identify your home institute and then figure out what might be a good fit. Now, some of you, like me, may have research that sort of spans institutes. And so you may want to think about which one may fit the best for you. So some of my projects go NHLBI and some go NIMH. I just put this together from that wizard that we did the example from. So it asks if you have independent funding or not. If you do, there's this KO2 option, which is not offered through NINDS, and I think they're cutting. NIH in general has been cutting back on sort of later career, mid-career development awards. If you need 3 years of mentor funding, if you don't need that, there's the Kangaroo Award, which I'll talk about more later, the K99 ROO, and then the K22 is also one that's not often offered. And then if so, we have KO1, K25, or K25, or do another postdoc, which is the F32 route. For physicians, the numbers after the limiters change somewhat. So for those that are looking for a career development award with 3 to 5 years of additional career development, the K23 and the KOAT are the main options. I just want to review sort of briefly the criteria for the NINDS options. So the KO1 I sort of mentioned before. This is for junior faculty support for individuals from underrepresented backgrounds. PhD or equivalent in the first 3 years of faculty period. I think that third bullet is pretty tough. If I certainly go back to my timeline, there was more than a 3-year gap between my initial project idea and my submission, and so that's not a lot of time to get that second submission in. But very generous research allowance, and it's a 3-year award. The KOAT is targeting those that are clinically trained, and it provides up to $95 per thousand a year at 75% effort with a $50,000 per year research allowance. For neurosurgeons, and the NIH specifically says because of the need to maintain sort of surgical skills, they allow them to go 50% on these awards, and these are for 3 to 5 years. And again, so the KOA is for health rate research, but it's not patient-oriented. There is a KOA in aging that's offered by NINDS. It's administered by the National Institute on Aging, and it uses the National Institute on Aging sort of funding mechanism for their case. This is what NIA does for their case. Instead of giving a certain percent salary plus this for research, what they do is they just give you a certain amount per year, and you have to take your salary from that and the rest. So if your salary is lower, you get more money for research, and vice versa. They try to encourage 3-year awards because as you see, the budget only goes up $100,000 a year for the 4th and 5th year of these projects. And these are 3 to 5. It has to be something related to aging. And it says specifically basic research in the title, although it's for a clinical degree, so I'm not quite sure what sort of projects might fit under that. But if you have something that might fit aging, something to think about would be a mechanism that's sort of aligned between the two. K-22 for, this is targeting PhDs or equivalents at NINDS, and they're looking for individuals from underrepresented backgrounds. And they have 2 phases. And I couldn't find on the direct application what triggers that phase shift. I'll talk about what triggers the phase shift for the Kangaroo grant, but you'll see here that the research money goes up quite a bit for phase 2. The K-23, this is what I have through NINH, and it's for clinically trained, and there's interest in 4 specific areas. Mechanisms of human disease, that's a pretty broad area though. I think you could probably put a lot of diseases into that. Therapeutic interventions in clinical trials are 2 of them, so very relevant for people attending this workshop, I think, since I suspect most or all of you are interested in both of those things. And then development of new technologies. This is 3 to 5, and they also can do, the neurosurgeons can do 50% effort on the K-23. There is a K-23 in aging. It uses the aging budget as well. And this is for more clinically oriented research instead of basic research in aging. It's offered through NINDS, but it's administered again by NIA. And then the K-25. So this is specifically for people with backgrounds in engineering, mathematics, statistics, that are interested in changing their focus to clinical research in the health sciences. It can be basic or clinical research. But you have to have a background. They have a list of fields that would sort of count as being quantitative fields. So this is for people that are sort of making a move from engineering into medicine or math into medicine. And then this is the sometimes referred to as the Kangaroo grant. They say it's for outstanding postdoctoral candidates with no more than 4 years postdoctoral research. The K-99 part is up to 2 years. And then the ROO part is 3 years. You can transition to a new institution. In fact, that's part of why this is set up, is so that you can do that with that transition. The ROO gets activated when you secure an independent research position. And when that does get activated, as you can see, you go into a different budget where you essentially get $249,000 per year, which would be sort of like an RO1-esque. And then in the first part, it's 20,000 research support. So when you kick to the ROO, you get a lot more funding. This is the graphs that I showed before, but where I'm taking out the options that are not present at NINDS. And so you can see here with the independent funding option that sort of drops. And so for those with a PhD equivalent, you have, if you need the 3 years of mentoring experience, the K01, K25, and of course the dreaded another postdoc. And then on the no category, the Kangaroo, and then K22. And then, of course, another option if you don't need mentored experience is to go straight to independent awards. And so RO3, they don't list R21 on there, but R21, RO1, these would be good options. And I said that dreaded postdoc, but I actually think that from talking to a lot of people, it is not a bad strategy to get more protected time and to continue your training if you can do so. So by no means am I saying that that's a bad option. For MDs, we have the K23 versus KOAT, depending if it's patient-oriented research or not. And then there's the Kangaroo grant, and there is a career transition award, which is specifically for individuals from underrepresented backgrounds. And then, of course, don't forget that there is an alternative to going through the K route. If you don't need supervised clinical research, applying for an independent award is always an option. It certainly will provide a better budget for research support. And you guys are interested in trials, which can be expensive. So here's some pearls that I got from talking to program at NINDS. They said that things that they're often not given enough thought in the applications they see. They want to make sure that there's active involvement mentorship, and they said that a good mentor-mentee interaction is often lacking. So they really want to see not just that you have a good mentor, but that there is going to be interaction there and some synergy. Institutional commitment is really important. So they said the chair should explicitly describe the protected time and not merely promise the 75% and the resources to do the work if you get funded. but really be demonstrating a commitment, and ideally a commitment even now, whether or not the award is funded. And then the NINDS programs and the career development plans are often presented as a boilerplate, where it looks like the same application they got from someone else at your institution, and maybe a couple courses changed or something like that. I think it's good to look at other people's applications, but I think you want to really think about what do I know, what do I need to know, and what sort of training plan can I put together to make that path. And again, I think sometimes it's harder than others, and for me it was very easy, but for some, if you're looking to continue sort of more linearly than I did, it can be a little harder to justify why do I need another 3 to 5 years of training in this area that I've already gone to, gotten great training in. NIMH, one of the first things they said as well, don't do generic career development plans. And they said explicitly discuss what you know and what you need to know. And the other thing they suggested is don't make them interpret. They said rarely will reviewers give the benefit of the doubt to the junior investigator. So they're not going to assume, oh, I'm sure this person's going to have a great plan, or I'm sure they thought about this for the project. If you didn't say it, they're likely going to assume that you just were naive and didn't think about it. NIMH said think about which institute is the most natural fit, and then talk to someone from that institute. Try to get a feel for do they have enthusiasm for what you're doing, and then what mechanisms might exist at that institute to enact what you want to do. There may be several people here where there may be more than one institute's a natural fit, or where it's not as clear what your institutional home is. One of the things that the program at NIMH suggested is what you're doing right now, setting you up for a K. They said that they really want to see preliminary data in their K award applications. And so if you're not working on something right now that's going to help provide that for your K, then you might want to rethink what are your research priorities right now and what should you be putting your time in. They said for evaluating the candidate that they tend to focus on first off their database publications. And they said check eligibility requirements and consider the timeline. And he gave you an example of someone that where for their next application, like I said earlier, they no longer met that criteria and they were out of luck, and they probably would have been able to push into a fundable score. So you want to think about that pretty carefully. All right. I'm just going to open it up to any questions, comments, thoughts. Yeah?
What was the difference between the KL2 and K23 since you got to have one?
Yeah, that's a great question. So KL2 is funded by the institution, who's then funded from the federal government, and you said the other was K23, so K23 comes directly from the institute. KL2s, there's some variability in how institutions put them together, but what they tend to have is similar protected time, but less of a budget for the work. At least in the past, you may want to double check with this. Time spent on a KL2 would get deducted from the max amount of time you could have on a K23. And so if you did a 2-year KL2, instead of a 5-year K23, your max would be at 3 years. But you want to double check all that because there's a lot of variability. So you want to, if you had one, you want to talk to program and see. So KL2s are often also linked to a specific educational program as well. They're often funded through CTSA grants, and so they'd be connected through whatever educational program is relevant from the CTSA. The KL2 here, when I had it for 2 months, it was 75% protected time, but I think the maximum salary, instead of being $90,000 like NIMH, I think it was 60 or 75. I know it was lower, and instead of $50,000 a year, it was $5,000 a year. And I remember part of that $5,000 had to be to go to one of their conferences, and so it ended up being great protected time, but really not the money needed to do my research at the time. But I think it's a lot of variability from institution to institution. Yes.
Yeah. So for those of us who are not from an underrepresented background,
yes,
the K opportunities in NINDS are somewhat limited. I know you said that the area of interest for NIMH was generic.
Yeah.
That's generic within the purview of NIMH, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. You not have to, that's within the purview of NIMH, but if you have something that fits with that, so if it's related to mental status or behavior, you could potentially do it. Now, NIMH they tend to really focus on the outcome. And so for some of my work, even though I'm doing working with populations with psychiatric disorders, any work I do with a vascular outcome, they won't touch it at all. And so those, for me, go to NHLBI. Even if I'm very clearly looking at stress and vasculitis. Now, if I look at effect of vascular disease on depression, then they're interested in it. But if I go the other way around, NIH is very clear that they're not interested in that. But if you have something that could relate to your psychiatric disorder, behavior, mental status, NIH would be a reasonable option, and there's definitely more flexibility, I think, on some of the career development options, especially for PhDs. Because it was, if you may recall, it was the PhD option specifically at NINDS that had that qualifier. So, good question.
So I think one of the things that you've said a couple times, and maybe just to stress it, and Robin and Scott can add in, but talking to someone at the program, so talking to the program officer is key. So if you're thinking about putting an application, before you put that application in, start talking to those people, because they will help direct you. They may say, this is not something our institute is interested in, and you need to go to NHLBI. And then, hopefully be able to connect you to somebody in that direction. But just sending an application in blind and having never talked to the program officer is a big mistake.
On that topic too, one thing I might add too is I think you want to do your homework too before you talk to them a little bit, because what you don't want to do is to pitch them an idea that is clearly not going to be something you'd be interested in, and they tell you no, and they're like, well, I can do it this way. Not that you can't have that conversation, but I don't think you want to make it look like that there's someone who figure out a way that it could fit first.
Scott or Janice, Scott, or just called you Janice, Robin. Look at yours, I know you.
That's okay, we have Janice in our office.
Janice? I'll call her Scott.
That's okay. I just want to make one point. You're absolutely right. I think that's why we spend so much time on the phone. But just to think of training grants, so every institute that has training programs are very coveted, and they're done at institutes. So, the institute does the reviews. They're not shopped back out to CSR. So these are not generic sorts of programs. And the institutes look at these things as the value is in training the fellow that are going to bring research back to that institute. That's why the fit has to be really good. Not that we have a project that kind of fits that institute, because we're investing in you, not just a project, because they believe that you're going to bring them grants back to that institute. That's how we build our portfolio programs. That's why, if you're in a particular area, why you may kind of, if you're in between, that's a good, I think, space to sort of talk the program and kind of see where you can kind of, because we do sort of share interests with certain other institutes, but I think that's kind of how that is funded. I think the ones I've seen that have been successful, it really becomes apparent, and there's sort of we can see where it's going to go in the future.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, and certainly when I talked to the program, they did emphasize that we're interested in sort of developing scientists here, that are going to be doing this line of work.
Yeah.
I was going to say the training office is really important, because Scott and I deal with mainly R11s and U01s, and we're senior investigators, so the training office and the individual institutes are very important for you all. Get to know the people there.
Great, thank you so much. Yes.
So I'm Brett Casal from Cincinnati. I'm talking, so sorry I couldn't be here till today. Just a couple comments. One about the Ks. I think I've mentored several PhDs doing clinical research. That's sometimes a tougher fit for the K awards, and I think it really makes sense to talk to the program officers related to K awards at institutes, because it feels a little bit sort of MD centric, the K awards a little bit, and so it just makes sense to sort of make sure the board is a good fit for you. With regard to KL2s, I had not heard about whether it counts against future K23, but at many institutions it's sort of a pre-K award. It's often people who already have a K in development, and it's meant to further that development along towards that path. And it's not uncommon for a KL2 awardee to cut their KL2 time short as they get their K23 or KOAT or whatever, apply for and accepted.
Great. I think that's our time. All right. Thank you guys.